I used to live in places with tropical weather pretty much my entire life, and that changed in 2019 when I decided to move to one of the coldest places on Earth located in Canada. The temperature could simply and casually go down to minus 47 degrees Celsius in the winter. Yep, I've experienced it. So, out of all the places in the world and coming from a tropical place or tropical country, why did I decide to move to this city located in Canada? In this video, I am going to tell you why. Hey friends, welcome back to the channel. My name is Fabi. On this channel, I share stories and lessons from my nonlinear life journey to encourage you to embrace your own journey and feel less alone in the process. In today's video, I want to talk about the reasons why I decided to move from Southeast Asia to one of the coldest cities in Canada or even the world. I am going to structure this video into 4 parts. We'll start with a backstory, and then we'll move on to why Canada, and then my 4 key reasons, and then we'll wrap up with conclusion. Without further ado, let's get started. Let me start with a little bit of a backstory of where I was. Before moving to Canada, I was living in Singapore and I was also working as a flight attendant with the national airline, which is Singapore Airlines. After flying for a couple of years, I concluded that I had outgrown my flight attendant era and then I would want to go back to school and pursue my MBA. And at the same time, I also had made up my mind that I would want to move away from Singapore and study somewhere else. So I did some research and I narrowed down my options into 2 countries, Australia and Canada. And after doing further research and understanding the job market in Australia and what kind of professions are on demand, I figured that Australia wouldn't work for me in terms of the job market as well as the opportunity that was available. And so I unfortunately had to check Australia off of my list because to me, moving somewhere else and restarting in life requires a lot of investment, time-wise as well as financial-wise. So I just didn't want to fight a losing battle, you know? After that, off I go. I went to do some research about Canada, and after doing further research, I figured that Canada would check all my boxes in terms of what matters to me and what I value the most in life at that point in time where I was making that decision. So then I went to do further research on the major cities, and of course, the top 3 cities that came up were Vancouver, Toronto, and Montreal. And if you're familiar with Canada, this might not come as a surprise to you at all. Did further research and then I settled with a city in Alberta called Edmonton. It is actually the capital city of the province. And I feel like not many people would actually know unless they were looking to immigrate or they were looking to move to Canada as well, other than the locals, obviously. Okay, so that is a little bit of a backstory in terms of where I was and then why Canada. Now let's move on to my 4 key reasons of why I decided to move to Edmonton at the first place. So the first one is affordable cost of living. When I decided to move from Singapore to Canada, I obviously had to quit my full-time job because my full-time job was based out of Singapore. And then the program, the MBA program that I applied to was a 2-year program. I had to quit my full-time job and I came here without a job. And then I also went to do a full-time study for 2 years. And that means that I had to live off of my savings for 2 years, and I wasn't sure at that time if I was able to secure any part-time job at all or how my bandwidth would look at that time with going back to school after a couple of years being out of school and being in the workforce, as well as me trying to assimilate to a new country, to the culture, to the weather. There was just so much going on. So I was just preparing myself to be a full-time student for 2 years while earning no income at all. So I had to be really discerning in terms of how I manage my finances. So with the many changes that I had to deal in life while moving from Singapore to Canada, I was being very cognizant of this fact and I try to eliminate financial stress as much as possible. I'm grateful for being able to do that debt-free. I didn't have any student debt at all, and I've actually talked about how I manage my finances while working as a flight attendant to enable me to do that. This is the video that you can check out if you're interested. Okay, so going back to cost of living, I feel like the expense that would take up the major portion of the monthly expenses is obviously rent. Let me pull up the rent price in 2019, the year that I moved to Canada. And as you can see here, a 1-bedroom apartment in Toronto would have costed me $2,500 a month, whereas in Vancouver, it would have costed me about $2,000. And now let's scroll down to Edmonton. And in Edmonton, a 1-bedroom apartment was up for grabs for $1,000. It's like half the price of the other major cities, as you can see. And at that time, I was being very frugal because I was literally living in student mode. So I even had roommates the first year I moved to Canada. So I paid even less than $1,000, which was helpful for me at that time. And then when we talk about taxes, because Edmonton is located in Alberta, so there's only GST, which is the goods and service tax, and there is no other taxes like provincial tax that Ontario, where Toronto is located, would have. I think the HST is 8%, or even in Vancouver, which is located in BC, where the PST or the provincial tax is 7%. And in Alberta, there are actually two major cities that people would usually keep an eye out when they look to move to the province, and those are Calgary and Edmonton. But the reason why I chose Edmonton over Calgary is not because of the cost of living, but it's more so the school ranking, which actually brings me to my next point: school ranking and school fee. I was trying to go to a reputable university in Canada that's also affordable. And I eventually went to the University of Alberta to do my MBA, and that is the university that's located in Edmonton. First, let's talk about the top ranked business schools in Canada, and here is the list. The tuition fees for international students could be significantly more expensive as compared to the locals, and this would depend on the schools themselves. Like, there is no hard and fast rule in terms of the average percentage, but international students would always pay more as compared to the locals. This is also why whenever we talk about immigration, it is such a burning topic, because it is the fact that the government makes money from immigration, and one of the major avenues being the inflow of international students. It also helps with the extra tuition fees that they would have to pay, or we would have to pay, because I was also an international student, as compared to the locals. To paint a fuller picture for you, here are some stats that I gather from the school's official websites. As you can see here, the tuition fees for the University of Alberta is significantly lower as compared to the schools in BC or the East Coast. I'm talking about Toronto in particular. So with the more affordable tuition fees, coupled with the affordable cost of living that I mentioned in my first point, substantiated by the fact that it is still one of the top 10 business schools in Canada, despite the few downsides that Edmonton has, I thought that that would be the best option for me, so I went with it. The third reason is study length, that is tied to the work permit post-graduation. If you study for less than 2 years, your post-graduation work permit would be the exact same period as your study length. For example, if you enroll in a 1-year program, your post-graduation work permit would be also valid for a year. If you need to extend your work permit to continue working in Canada and you're not a PR yet, or you don't have a more permanent status, you would need to find an employer that wants to sponsor you, which could be tough knowing the number of international students and other types of immigrants that do not need any sponsorship to support their employment. Whereas if you study for 2 years or more, the length of your post-graduation work permit would be 3 years. Since I was kind of planning on staying after graduation to gain some work experience, as well as to experience living in a place that's very different as compared to where I came from, I wanted to make sure that I gave myself enough time to find a job, to do whatever that I needed to do. At that time, I heard that it could take 6 months to find a full-time job in Canada. And so I didn't want to add unnecessary stress. Like, imagine if my program is just a 1-year program and then I spent 6 months being on a post-graduation work permit to find a job, and then I would only be left with another 6 months to work. Whereas to apply for PR or to do anything else, I would need more than that. My program was a 2-year program, and I was granted a 3-year post-graduation work permit. That would give me enough time to first find a job, and then second, think about my next steps in Canada. Last but not least is something that I have alluded to in my previous point. It is to gain new experience in life and live somewhere that is very different from where I used to live. From the vibes, Edmonton is such a community city, and the population is only sitting at 1.1 million people as of 2022. I was living in Edmonton. The downtown area honestly didn't feel like downtown at all. It was too quiet to be called a downtown from my POV as someone who came from such a big, busy metropolitan city, such as Singapore, like the place that I used to live in before I came to Canada. Pace of living is different and people are more chill in general, which is really nice as well. And I will say that Alberta in general is not as much of a melting pot as compared to, say, Toronto, and also does not have as much Asian influence as compared to, say, Vancouver. So in a way, it sort of helped me assimilate to the culture. I'm not opposed to it either way. Like now I live in Vancouver, but I just try to point out the silver lining. And it was such a great experience for me to first move to Edmonton when I first came to Canada. So I stayed there for 2 years and then I graduated and then I moved out to Vancouver because I got a Vancouver-based role with a company that is headquartered in Toronto. I wanted to highlight that this is an intentional move. It wasn't that I followed wherever the job took me, but it was more so I tried to find a job in Vancouver because I went to Vancouver while I was still living in Edmonton and I really liked it here. I'll talk more about why I chose to move from Alberta to BC in general in my next video because I feel like it is a loaded question as well. I think the takeaway of this video is like, moving to a new country is a big life decision, so make sure that you do your research and find what works best for you. I do think that uncertainties and surprises will always be there no matter how much research you do, but at least when you do your research and you make calculated risks and make as much of an informed decision as you could, that would eliminate any unnecessary stress and also any mystery and black box that you might have to face once you're in a new country. I feel like moving to a new place does take a lot of courage, so if you have done this before or you're in the process of doing so, kudos to you. I do think that life is meant to be experienced, and this is something that I like to mention in my videos as well. For me personally, I'd rather experience things than be left with what ifs because I just don't want to live with regrets. And I feel like in life, you can't always win, but you'll either win or you learn. So I feel like just live your life, don't bubble wrap your life, you know? And of course, everyone's situation is different, everyone's risk tolerance is different, so I can't speak for everyone. But since this is about my story, I can only speak from my own lens and my perspective and my POV. That is all I have for today's video, folks. Just to recap, we talked about why I chose to move to one of the coldest cities in the world or even in Canada called Edmonton. We talked about my backstory and then we discussed my 4 key reasons and then conclusion. So I hope that you find this video useful, and if you do, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't already. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a good day and I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye.